Welcome to PALITICUS, the only podcast that discusses politics and public service from the Portuguese-American perspective. Here we discuss everything from federal policy, local issues, and U.S.-Portugal relations with the goal of driving more discussion and awareness of the issues affecting our nation, our community, and what we as Portuguese-Americans can do about it. And now, PALITICUS. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of PALITICUS. My name is Angela Simoes, and I'm here with my co-host, Denise Borges. Hi, Denise. How are you?
Fine. How are you? So excited for this podcast.
Yes, I'm very, very excited. We have Richard Pombo on the line today, and I'll share my little story when he comes on the line in a bit. But yeah, and I'm very excited. So welcome, Richard, to the PALITICUS podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be on with you.
So for those of you who don't know Richard...
Does he really need an introduction?
I know. I mean, if you're from California especially, you probably know him. But
let's do it anyway, yeah.
Former congressman, and you're going to tell us about your path to get there. But now you're a partner at Gavel Resources, which is a consulting and lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. And I just want to give my quick little story. So Richard, your first congressional campaign was my first campaign that I ever worked on, and I was in high school. So my friends and I were making phone calls for lawn signs and support and things like that. And I will never, ever forget that. It was very impressionable at the time. So I will always remember that. And you actually came to one of my fundraisers because I was running for Luso Queen at the time. So we go way back. And so I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. So welcome.
Well, thank you. And that first campaign was a lot of fun. It was very, very grassroots. I know your parents got involved and you got involved, and I had people up and down the valley that were making phone calls for me and walking precincts, and it's about as much of a grassroots campaign as you could ever run.
I remember that. Yeah, my dad was quite involved, so it was really amazing. So why don't you give us a little bit of background about how you first became interested in running for office, and did you hold an office before running for Congress? Tell us a little bit about your path and how you got there.
Well, I was not necessarily one of those guys that grew up wanting to be in politics. Nobody in my family had ever been in office before, elective office at any level. And so it really wasn't something that we, as a family had ever been involved with. There were always, political discussions over at the dinner table, talking about what was going on in the country or the world. And, I was always interested in my parents, what they had to say and their take on things. So I had an interest in history and in politics because of that, but it wasn't something I grew up wanting to get involved with. As you know, Angela, my family's a farm family from the Central Valley of California. I grew up on a cattle ranch, and I assumed that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life, was to grow up on the ranch and stay there and raise my children there, which I have. My kids live on the ranch and were raised on the cattle ranch like I was. But in the mid to late 80s, I started getting involved with the private property rights movement, protecting the rights of farmers that were being regulated to death and not able to use their land the way that they thought was best. So I started getting involved with that. And over time, I used to say we need to get more people elected to office so we have people that see the world from our point of view. And somebody finally told me, well, why don't you run? And I was young and dumb enough to think I could win. And I first ran for the City Council in my hometown and was elected in 1990. And then a year later, I announced I was running for Congress and ended up being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1992.
I mean, that's a huge jump from city councilman to congressman. Talk about that transition. And you mentioned something that we talk about here on PALITICUS all the time, and why we have this podcast and why we do what we do, encouraging people to get involved. And that was, you you said we need more people in office that see things from our perspective and will fight for what we want. And that's exactly what we're trying to accomplish here and get the Portuguese community to understand, is that why do we need more Portuguese Americans in office? So that people that have our point of view and have our best interests at heart are in office and will fight for us. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that aspect of, that was one of your reasons for getting into office. But talk about going from Tracy City Council to U.S. Congressman. That had to have been insane.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a huge jump. It was not something I was necessarily prepared for. The only time I had ever been to Washington previously, when I was in high school, the Future Farmers, I was part of a trip back to Washington with the Future Farmers when I was a junior in high school. And that was the only other time I'd ever been to Washington. So after I was elected, I, jumped on a plane and came back to Washington and began the process of transitioning into becoming a member. And doing that, I was young, as I said, and I was the youngest member of Congress at that time.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, and I was 31 years old, and the average age of my class, which was 114 new members, was 58. So there was a big difference, and most people around the Capitol thought I was a staffer. They thought I was a member of somebody's staff. And so it was a big transition just getting in to do that. But one thing that stuck out of my mind, talking about getting more Portuguese Americans involved in politics and how important it is. When I first got elected, I had a little party in my office on the day that we were sworn in, and the Portuguese ambassador came in and to meet me and talk to me. And I thought it was really neat that, he would come, the ambassador from Portugal would come to my office to meet with me. And I later found out it was because I was the only person of Portuguese descent serving in Congress at that time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's why he made a special effort to come and meet me and talk to me. So, it gave me an opportunity to see just how important that was. And over the time that I spent there, I developed a relationship with him and was able to work and be, I guess, a conduit for a number of different issues that were important, not just to Portuguese Americans, but to Portugal itself.
When you were in Congress, obviously you were the only Portuguese American for a while there, because then, it was a few years since the current class of Portuguese Americans were elected to Congress, and prior to that, Dennis Cardozo, et cetera. I know that you did quite a bit of work also with PALCUS and also with setting up the caucuses and the Friends. And tell us a little bit about how that whole process went, being that you were kind of the only one there for a while.
Yeah, and when we put together the Portuguese caucus, I was at the time the only member of Congress that was of Portuguese descent, but Patrick Kennedy at the time represented Rhode Island, which has a large Portuguese population. There were others who had large Portuguese populations within their districts that we were able to convince them to become members of the caucus. And it allowed us to put together a decent bipartisan group of members who were willing to advocate on behalf of issues that were important to the community.
Expanding on that, what was the original, it might be obvious, but what was the original purpose or goal? What was your selling point for establishing the caucus? And then how did that also translate into forming the Friends in the Senate? Did you have anything to do with that?
Yeah, and the original purpose was, in sitting down with the ambassador, we had a number of issues like the Visa waiver issue, mm-hmm. where Portugal was treated differently than other European countries. We had the tax treaty issue. There were a lot of things that were hanging out there that no one had ever addressed. And I knew as a freshman member that it was going to be difficult, for me by myself to be able to motivate those issues. And then later on, as a member of Congress, it just needed a bipartisan group to get behind some of these different issues. When we talked about immigration, there were a lot of different things that impacted the Portuguese community in this country and their ability to deal with back home. So we kind of went back and forth on all these different issues. And then finally, when we put the caucus together, it gave us an opportunity to work with a more unified voice and a louder voice to work on behalf of those issues. It was interesting to me that you had different ethnic communities within the United States. There are more Portuguese Americans than there are Greek Americans, and yet we had nowhere near the political power that the Greek Americans had. And it gave us an opportunity to raise our voices and to have a greater political impact because of that.
And why do you think that is? The whole, even though we have more, but there are more Portuguese than there are Greek Americans, but yet the Greeks have more political power. Why do you think that is?
Well, part of it, I think, is quite frankly cultural. Most Portuguese Americans are hardworking people that keep their nose down and do their job or run their business.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yep. They don't want to get involved with things because, I think it's cultural back to Portugal and different things that happen and different reasons why they left and came to the United States to begin with. And I think that because of that, they're less likely to be involved. If you look at the Portuguese Americans who have been elected to Congress, for the most part, it's all from the Central Valley of California. Mm-hmm. And that may not be the highest percentage of Portuguese American residents, but they have become more politically active coming out of California. Even somebody like Senator Nighthorse Campbell, who was elected to the Senate from Colorado, was actually born in California, and he came out of California and ended up moving to Colorado and got involved in politics there. But for whatever reason, we have had a much more active community in California than most of the rest of the country.
And you make a very good point when you mention exactly in that, of course, the history. I mean, it was tough for many Portuguese Americans, as you said, because they were here to work hard to build, whatever they could for themselves and their families. And they had come from a country that had no political culture, for 50 years because of the situation there. And prior to that, it was, turmoil and of course, prior to that, the Kingdom of Portugal. But when you mentioned that there are quite a few Portuguese Americans, but yet not enough to kind of tilt an election, obviously. So when you ran for Congress yourself, I mean, Tracy has, in that area has quite a few Portuguese Americans, but obviously you had to build coalitions with other ethnic groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I credit the Portuguese American community in California with playing a very large role in my first election and my ability to be elected to begin with, because even people who didn't live directly in my district were very supportive of me. They worked on my campaign. They donated money. They were extremely involved in my campaign. And, whether they were Democrat, Republican, it didn't matter. They saw value in having a Portuguese American elected to Congress. So they were very involved. But it's not a large enough percentage of voters on its own, but it does play a role.
Correct. But, most Portuguese Americans, such as yourself and the current three that are, in Congress, David Valadão and Devon Nunes, and of course, Jim Costa as well. It's interesting how they all have this commonality, as you mentioned, being from the Valley, as you are, and also being able to, tap into the Portuguese American community while building, coalitions with different communities throughout the Valley. That seems to be kind of the secret.
Yeah, it does. But we have we have areas of the country where they have a higher percentage of population, but they have not been successful in electing members of Congress. And I would love to see a Portuguese American coming out of Massachusetts or Rhode Island or some of the areas where there's a high concentration of Portuguese Americans. And in fact, I spent time campaigning and going into Massachusetts with different state assembly races, state house races and stuff to campaign for guys to get, to try to build them up and get more involvement out of it. So I would love to see that happen and not just be a California.
Sure.
A California thing.
Yeah, we just had our first from Massachusetts, a young lady, Lori Loredo Trahan, who has identified as Portuguese American. But that's been such a, as you said, it's been a work for many years or decades. One other aspect of the Portuguese American community, the community is, of course, much different than it was in 1992, especially here in California, as the community becomes much more Americanized, let's put it that way, because immigration has ceased from Portugal just about to 0.0 in the last few years, especially in the last 20 years. And as people become, of course, more American and more integrated, do you feel that part of this trend that has happened more in California than other parts of the country has been because really in the Valley, the community has always been part of the whole entire state? In other words, we've integrated really well. Do you think that's part of the reason why we've been able to participate a little bit more in politics?
I think that's part of it. I think that such a high percentage of the people who immigrated into California started businesses and became recognized as successful businessmen has helped. There are a lot of large agricultural operations which are Portuguese owned, Portuguese American owned. I think that has a certain stature to it and helps in the political world in getting them involved with things. And also the Portuguese community in California is close within themselves. They are culturally close and have stayed that way, but they have integrated in and become very important parts of California's economy.
Let's talk a little bit about the Visa Waiver and Tax Treaty that you worked on when you first got into office. Explain a little bit about what each one of those were and why it was important to push those through, and are they still relevant today? I mean, I think they are, but I think it's kind of a vague thing for people when they hear Visa Waiver and Tax Treaty. Like, what exactly does that mean and how is it relevant?
Well, at the time, there were only two countries in Europe, in Western Europe, that did not have a visa waiver, where you had to go and go to the embassy and obtain a waiver, a visa to go into the United States. And the two countries were Portugal and Greece. And obviously, it was seen as a slight or somewhat of an insult by the Portuguese government that they weren't treated the same as Spain or the United Kingdom or France or anybody else. And that was a somewhat symbolic but important issue in the relationship between Portugal and the United States. And it was one of the issues that I took on. We were able to get that so that people could freely go back and forth from Portugal just as they could from just about every other European country. So at the time, it was seen as an important step forward. The relationship between Portugal and the United States has always been very strong. Portugal has always supported the United States at the United Nations. They've been a consistent and strong ally for many decades. And it's important that relationship stay there and remain a strong relationship. And there was no reason for them to be singled out and not treated the same way as our other allies in Western Europe. So we were able to get that done. Later on, we had the tax treaty, which basically allows a person who has income to pay taxes just in one country and not have to to pay taxes and be treated differently. I found out when I was first elected, that this was an issue that had been a subject of negotiations with the State Department and the Department of Treasury with Portugal since before I was even born. And
Oh, wow.
they were still negotiating on that issue. And with the help of others like Barney Frank and some of the members of the Portuguese caucus, we were able to get that issue through and to have the tax treaty signed and finally move forward and have them treated equally as to how other Western European countries were being treated.
And both of those issues are still relevant today because it still affects people today, right? So like from the visa waiver, I mean, that enables people to come visit Portugal. And so like if somebody's coming for a wedding or for a funeral or whatever, they can hop on a plane and come over. There's not a delay, and there's not a fear of missing an event, right? So it allows freer travel even to this day. And I will say, when 9/11 happened, I think all countries in the Visa Waiver Program were kind of up for review, right? And the United States was thinking about revoking some status from some countries. And again, this is where the establishment of the caucus and the Friends in the Senate, the caucus in the House and the Friends in the Senate, this is where, the fact that we had them already established played a really important role, because we were able to rally their support to say, no, Portugal has to stay in the Visa Waiver Program. You can't revoke that status. So that's why it is important to have these groups, and just getting people to understand that, I think is important, because it seems like a very nebulous concept to people and they don't quite get it. So laying it out, explaining it, I think is really important. And the tax treaty is also very relevant today. So there are more and more people are getting dual citizenship, or, have businesses there or property there. And now they're only, required to pay taxes one place, that they're not going to get taxed twice. So it still is very relevant today, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And when it comes to immigration and the visa waiver, and those are issues that are always kind of in flux, and they're always, based on the politics of the day or the events of the day. They always relook at issues like that. So that's one of those issues that you kind of always have to stay on top of every time they start to talk about, whether to change the status of particular countries. It's just something you always have to stay on top of. Mm-hmm. And as far as the tax treaty, you just want Portugal to be treated the same way as other allies and other Western European countries, and whatever's fair is the way it should work for all of our allies.
Agreed.
One quick question, if I may, Congressman, from all your involvement in, of course, in the political world and your involvement in serving in Congress, and now in the process, of getting people elected to Congress. The Portuguese-American community, as we've been talking about, has been changing. People are more into education now than they were maybe 30, 40 years ago. People have always been very successful business-wise. I concur wholeheartedly with you, even though those who came from Portugal with little or no education, it's just amazing how much they built, for themselves and for this country as they immigrated to America. But now that we're talking about, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren in a lot of cases, and people are becoming more and more into getting a degree or getting some kind of an education, whether it be technical or academic. What would be your advice to young Portuguese Americans who are listening to the podcast and who may be thinking of doing something innovative, such as Richard Pombo did in 1992?
Well, my best advice that I would give is that start getting involved with politics at the local level. Start engaging in local campaigns. And learning the way that the process works, what you have to do. It's always important to have life examples, life experience, things that affect how you feel about things or what your positions are, or your opinions. I have very strong opinions and very strong beliefs, and mostly because of where I was raised and how I was raised, and the good fortune of having a great family. But everybody needs those experiences and experiences in life and start getting involved with campaigns. I would run, if somebody really wants to get involved, I would run for a local office, whether it be, a school board or a city council like I did, and have that experience and see if it's something you really want to do, because it's a lot different when it's your name on the ballot and you have people criticizing you or people that really dislike you that you've never met. And it is a different experience, but it's something that I would encourage people to get involved to find out if it's really something they want to do. And, Devin Nunes was on the school board before he ran for Congress. I mean, he went from a community college district board to being a member of Congress. I went from being on the city council of a small town to being a member of Congress. That working your way in and getting that taste of it, and whether or not that's something you really want to do with your life. For a lot of people, they may just want to get involved and support others, but we do need people from the Portuguese community that are willing to run, that are willing to put their name on the ballot and work and get elected.
And you mentioned something there that, if you can comment as well a little bit more on it, not everybody's going to make it to Congress. Not everybody wants to be maybe even a congressman or at the national level, but it used to be said as, I think it was Tip O'Neill used to say the famous line, all politics is local. But how important is it for Portuguese Americans, even if they have no desire to go to a national campaign or national level, to be involved in school boards and community college boards like Devin was, and like John Pedrosa is now from Merced, and many others? How do you take that, someone who gets Portuguese Americans and someone who's involved in politics all these years? What would you say to those who are thinking at a local level? Is it still as important as it once was?
It absolutely is, and one thing that people don't realize is that your local elected offices, your city council, your board of supervisors, your school boards, those have much more of an impact on people's day-to-day lives than Congress does. Congress is seen as this big federal position, but quite frankly, your local city council or board of supervisors has a much bigger impact on your life than Congress does, because it's day to day. When you look at a school board race, there's nothing more important than your kid's education, and the people who make the biggest decisions that impact your children's education are serving on a school board. A decision like, for a Portuguese American, a decision like, is Portuguese going to be offered as a language, a second language class in school? There's issues like that you can have an impact on. There are issues that really do affect people and make a difference. Portuguese is a widely spoken language throughout the world. It's one of the biggest, largest spoken languages around the world, and yet in most of our schools, it's not even an option to teach that.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
You hit the nail on the head with exactly an issue that we talk about so often, which is the Portuguese language. And you're absolutely right. Unless we have our own advocates in public office to push for us and to have Portuguese offered, it's never going to happen. So you hit the nail on the head with that one.
And things have been changing. Our latest, not probably fully correct because of people's names changes and things like that. But in this election, 82 Portuguese Americans, we identified 82 Portuguese Americans in California that ran for office, and 55 of them got elected. And so right now, at all sorts of different levels, from school boards to Congress, we have over 125 Portuguese Americans elected. But, there's quite a few thousands of us, so we have a way to go. But it's a good step, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my old congressional district, one of my former staff members, Marla Souza Livingood, was the Republican candidate on the ballot. Mm-hmm. And, I was very proud of that for a lot of reasons, that she ran, and, she was not successful, but she ran, and she ran a good campaign.
No, that's awesome. So we just have a few minutes left. We want to hear about what you're doing now with Gavel Resources. Tell us a little bit about your work there, and how did you transition from, Congress, and did you jump right into Gavel Resources, or did you do other things?
No, I actually, after I left Congress, I went home, moved back to Tracy and stayed there. And then a few years ago, a couple of my former staff members were working on at the time the farm bill, and they asked me if I would be willing to come back and help them representing some of their clients, agricultural clients, and I did it. And what grew out of that was Gavel Resources, and we are a government relations firm. We do lobbying, we do public affairs. A lot of what we do is related directly to agriculture or the resource issues because of my background in Congress and the issues that I worked on. So, it kind of just grew out of that. And now we have a 7-person firm that works on a number of different issues, from defense issues and foreign policy issues to energy and agriculture. So it's just something that kind of grew out of a conversation I had a few years ago, and now I split my time between Washington and California.
And what are some of the well, I was going to say, what are some of the issues? But I think maybe a better question would be, would you say that, getting right into, like, if somebody doesn't want to run for Congress or run for a public office, but they do want to get into the advocacy work, is getting into lobbying something that's possible? Like, can you go straight into a consulting firm? They do that? Yeah,
absolutely. And what it involves is, knowledge of certain topics, certain issues. One of the things that we do a lot on is in the energy sector. It's everything from getting pipelines approved that cross public land or federal land somewhere. We spend a lot of time on issues that are directly related to the energy world. But I also have clients like Native American tribes across the country. In fact, one of the ones I'm working with right now is from Massachusetts, the Mashpee, which are the original Thanksgiving Day Indian tribe, and they have an issue with land, having land taken into trust for a reservation, and I've been working with them on that. And it's kind of funny because of the intermarriages and everything else. A number of their tribal members have Portuguese surnames. So, it just kind of goes around. But
And then you're going to continue your work with Gavel Resources. But what anything in the future, anything planned that you'd like to share?
No, I mean, I don't really have a desire to run for office again. I get my opportunity to participate in policy and to work on issues that I think are important in the political world. So I'm happy doing that. My kids are all growing up now and out of the house, so it gives me more flexibility to travel and do things like this. So I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying life.
Well, and you have an influence without having to run a campaign. Those are getting quite expensive nowadays, aren't they?
Yeah, you're exactly right.
David Valadeo mentioned to me that he just got elected, and he says, believe it or not, 2 days later, I'm going to start campaigning again for the next 2 years. It's kind of crazy, but that's the way it is nowadays.
Yeah, well, when you're a member of the House and you run every 2 years, that's absolutely right. You never really stop campaigning. You never have a chance to sure. Stop and do that, but it's all part of it, and it's the way our founding fathers designed it to be.
Correct.
Well, this has been great. I think we covered a lot of topics, and you've done so much, and I hope that people will look to your your career is inspiring, and that we have inspired a few more people to get involved in the political process in some way, shape, or form. Even if that's, like myself, when you're in high school and you're working a campaign and making some phone calls or stuffing envelopes or something, just to get involved. But so thank you very much for your time, Richard, Congressman.
Well, thank you.
Really happy to have you.
Appreciate it very much.
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me. I'd love to do it again sometime.
We will.
Will for sure. And thanks everybody out there for listening in and sticking with us for this episode. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, please do. Please also leave us a review on iTunes. It will actually help people find us. We are the only podcast that discusses politics from a Portuguese point of view. So let's help to spread the word about Politicus and get more people listening so we can have more and better conversations about Portuguese in politics. And with that, we'll say thanks everybody. And have a great day. Thank you for listening to Politicus, the official podcast of PALCUS, the Portuguese-American Leadership Council of the United States. PALCUS is the premier national organization representing the interests of the Portuguese-American community at large. To learn more about PALCUS and how to become a member or to make a donation, visit www.palcus.org. To submit feedback or suggestions about the podcast, email us at palcus@palcus.org. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of the show are not endorsed by PALCUS.